I had just finished my final round of radiation on Tuesday. My hair hadn't even begun to grow back. My body still trembling from the sleepless nights and the slow ache that only survivors know. By Wednesday morning, I was summoned to the 12th floor, the glass-walled conference room, polished to sterile perfection, where I'd spent over 2 decades pitching growth strategies, celebrating quarterly wins, and building futures. But this time, there were no cupcakes, no applause. Just a cold, rehearsed face of Derek Langston, the new CEO of Mayfield Dynamics, who once interned under me and now sat cross-legged in the leather chair I had personally picked out for his predecessor. "Frank, the company is restructuring," he said, his tone flat, emotionless, like a finance update delivered by a man who'd never missed a latte. "Unfortunately, your position will be eliminated at the end of the month." I didn't speak, I didn't beg, I didn't even blink. There was nothing left to say. Only the kind of silence that settles when you've seen something coming and still hoped you were wrong. "Oh," he added, as if what came next was just a footnote. "You'll need to train your replacement. She starts tomorrow. I trust you'll be professional about it." I almost laughed, not from humor, but from the absurdity of it all. 30 years of service, holding this company through economic storms, carrying teams through mergers, sacrificing birthdays, anniversaries, even the nights my wife was in chemo, and now, just months after I survived cancer myself, they were trading me in for a shinier, younger model who hadn't weathered a single real storm. I stood, shook his hand out of habit, not respect, and glanced at my reflection in the floor-to-ceiling window, just a faded outline of a man Chicago winters had aged in ways no mirror could ever fully show. They thought they had closed my final chapter, but they didn't know I had already begun writing another book quietly, page by page, ever since the day the doctor said stage 2. And what they forgot is that I'm not just some expendable employee past his prime. I'm Frank Carter. And tomorrow, while I'm training the woman meant to replace me, I'll be preparing to take back everything they tried to erase, and more. When I first walked through the glass doors of Mayfield Dynamics, it wasn't a tech empire or a corporate player on Wall Street's radar. It was a scrappy little consultancy with a leaky ceiling and 3 shared printers, one of which only worked if you kicked it first. I was just Frank Carter back then, 41 years old, freshly laid off from a failing logistics firm, carrying a resume no one read and a heart full of doubt. I wasn't young enough to be impressive, nor old enough to be respected. I was invisible, but I still showed up every morning with my sleeves rolled and my ego tucked away, determined to build something I could finally be proud of. Back then, the company was led by Gerald Mayfield, a quiet war veteran who believed more in people than in spreadsheets. He didn't care about fancy degrees or who talked the loudest in meetings. He watched how you treated the janitor and how you behaved when no one was watching. For some reason, he saw something in me I hadn't yet seen in myself. Maybe it was the way I stayed late, not to impress, but because I hated unfinished work. Or maybe he recognized the hunger in my eyes, the kind that comes when life's kicked you around and you're tired of being on your back. Gerald gave me chances that others wouldn't. He handed me tough clients no one else wanted, risky projects everyone quietly hoped would fail, and I handled each one like it was my last shot. Slowly, I built a reputation, not as the flashiest strategist in the room, but as the one who could be trusted when it counted. I didn't climb the ladder with charm or buzzwords. I climbed it rung by rung, through crises, layoffs, takeovers, and more coffee than I'd care to admit. Over time, I became the guy they turned to when a deal was falling apart at midnight, or when a product launch needed salvaging after 3 months of mismanagement. I'd sit in boardrooms across the country, New York, Dallas, Seattle, always the last to speak but the first to listen. And while younger hires came in with flashy titles and faster laptops, they couldn't see what I saw. That people remember how you treat them, not just what you sell them. I poured everything into Mayfield Dynamics, missed anniversaries, postponed vacations, and yes, even moments I should have been at the hospital with my wife instead of fixing a last-minute investor pitch. It wasn't because I didn't love her God. I did, but because back then I thought loyalty mattered. I believed that if you gave everything, one day, when it mattered most, that loyalty would come back to you. But Gerald passed away a stroke in his sleep at 67, and with him, the last remnants of that old world integrity disappeared. The company didn't pause to grieve. Within a week, the board named Derek Langston interim CEO, the same kid who once shadowed me during client calls, now parading around like the heir to something he never earned. At first, I gave him the benefit of the doubt. I mentored him when others rolled their eyes. I covered for his missteps, rewrote his sloppy reports, and even defended his decisions in meetings where I knew he was wrong, all because I believed in giving people room to grow, the same way Gerald once gave that to me. But it didn't take long to realize Derek wasn't interested in growth. He was interested in optics, in building a facade of leadership, while hollowing out everything that had once made this place special. He started bringing in his own people, smooth-talking consultants, with aggressive visions but no sense of history. One by one, the old guard was quietly pushed out. The ones who'd carried this place through 2 recessions and a pandemic were labeled outdated, inflexible, or simply not aligned with the new direction. I watched friends and colleagues pack up their desks, while younger replacements were ushered in with stock options and signing bonuses. I watched departments get gutted in the name of innovation, and mentorship programs get axed because they didn't scale. I watched our mission, the soul of what Gerald built, get traded for presentation slides and empty slogans. And then came the diagnosis: stage 2 prostate cancer. It hit me like a freight train, not just because of what it meant for my body, but because I knew deep down what it would mean for my standing here. Illness, especially in men like me, isn't seen as a struggle. It's seen as weakness. And in Derek's version of Mayfield dynamics, weakness was a liability. Still, I kept working through it. I attended meetings with bandages hidden beneath my sleeves. I replied to emails from hospital beds. I trained junior staff between radiation appointments and never asked for sympathy, only time. But what I didn't realize, or perhaps refused to accept, was that in their eyes, I was no longer an asset. I was a burden, a ticking clock, a relic of an era they were trying to erase. They didn't see the man who had stayed through 3 buyouts and never once asked for a raise. They didn't see the strategist whose quiet work had saved the company from a lawsuit in 2011 or secured their largest client in 2017. They saw thinning hair, trembling hands, and a resume that didn't have the word disrupt on it. And so while I was fighting for my life in a hospital room, Derek was drafting a restructure plan. By the time I returned, pale and scarred but standing, the decision had already been made. They just needed me to train my replacement. But what Derek didn't know, what none of them knew, was that while they were busy replacing me, I had already begun replacing them. Not out of spite, not even out of anger, but out of something deeper, something Gerald once whispered to me during my first promotion. Frank, real leadership isn't loud. It listens. And when the time comes, it knows how to rise. Well, the time was coming, and I was already rising. The next morning arrived with the same gray stillness that had haunted the hallways ever since Gerald passed. I arrived early, as I always had, though this time my walk down the corridor felt different. Not heavier, exactly, but quieter, as if the building itself knew something was shifting beneath the surface. I passed the familiar desks, each one manned by someone I had trained, mentored, or protected over the years. Yet not a single pair of eyes lifted to meet mine. A few offered a polite nod, the kind reserved for acquaintances in an elevator, not for the man who had once stood beside them through layoffs, late nights, and losses. The silence wasn't accidental. It had been curated quietly, deliberately, ever since Derek took over. No one wanted to be seen too close to me now, not while the winds of change were blowing in favor of younger blood and fresher faces. Association with me was no longer a mark of respect, but a liability, and people here had grown smart enough to sense when the tide was turning and quick enough to step out of the undertow. And then I saw her, Emily Monroe, the so-called replacement. She stood by the glass elevator in a tailored navy suit, far too crisp for her 20-something frame, tapping her manicured nails against the steel handrail as she scrolled on her phone. She didn't look nervous, she looked expectant, as if this was her stage and she'd merely been waiting for the curtain to rise. When I introduced myself, she shook my hand with the detached grace of someone who had already been told they were the future. Mr. Langston said you'd walk me through the major accounts, she said, offering a tight-lipped smile that didn't reach her eyes. I'm eager to dive in and bring a new vision to the table. It wasn't her fault, not really. She was doing what ambitious people do, grabbing opportunities, saying the right words, performing confidence like she'd been coached to. But it still stung, not because she was there, but because Derek had made it so easy. He hadn't just replaced me, he had erased me, stripped away decades of service with a single memo and ensured that even my exit would be on his terms. I led her into the conference room I used to call my war room, where deals were once salvaged over midnight coffee and client crises turned into victories. Now, she perched in my usual seat like she owned it, critiquing the data I laid out as though my strategies were relics from a bygone era. Every time she interrupted with a buzzword-laden opinion or dismissed years of tested practices as stagnant, I felt a crack widen not in my pride, but in the illusion that any of this had ever truly been mine. What cut deepest wasn't her ignorance, or even Derek's betrayal. It was the silence of those who had once stood beside me. I watched them avoid my gaze in the break room, whisper behind glass doors they used to open freely when I walked by. Men I had vouched for during performance reviews. Women whose ideas I had championed when others ignored them. People I had shielded from layoffs, even when it cost me leverage at the table. All of them now playing their roles in Derek's new narrative, one where I was the old guard, the obstacle to progress, the wounded animal too proud to admit defeat. I wanted to hate them. God knows a part of me did. But another part, the part shaped by Gerald's quiet mentorship and my wife's unshakable grace, knew better. They weren't cruel. They were scared. Scared that standing with me meant standing against the machine, and no one had the stomach for resistance when promotions were at stake and livelihoods dangled on Derek's whims. Still, the betrayal lingered. It clung to me in the way the receptionist stopped making small talk, and how my calendar slowly emptied without explanation, and how the quarterly meeting I used to lead was suddenly moved without notice. I became a ghost in the place I had helped build, haunting the same halls where once my voice had carried weight. And yet, I endured. I showed up every day. I trained Emily without bitterness, masking the tremor in my hands with controlled breath, explaining why retention matters more than acquisition when you're selling trust, not just product. She barely listened. But I did my part, not for her, not for Derek, but for the legacy they thought they could bury without consequence. What they failed to understand was that I had been preparing long before this. While they were busy distancing themselves from me, I had been drawing closer to something deeper, a plan, seeded quietly over the past few years, watered by every moment I stayed late, by every share I purchased through shadowed accounts, by every nod I gave in meetings where they underestimated me. They believed I was fading, but in truth, I was consolidating. And though the betrayal still burned, it no longer consumed me, because I knew something they didn't. They thought they were pushing me out. But I was already inside, and soon I would show them just how deeply. The night after I trained Emily Monroe for the first time, I sat alone in my apartment, surrounded by unopened mail, fading family photos, and the low hum of a refrigerator that had outlived 2 coffee makers and a marriage. My body ached not from the cancer, but from the quiet grief that comes when a man realizes the world around him has already moved on. I stared at the ceiling, then at the spot on the wall where my wife's get well soon card still hung, curling slightly at the edges. She'd passed just over a year ago, and somehow, losing the job felt like losing her all over again, another piece of my past being packed up and pushed aside. But I didn't fall apart. I couldn't. Not because I was fearless, but because I had lived through enough nights like this to know that pain has a purpose if you let it. I returned to Mayfield Dynamics the next day and the days that followed with the same stoic rhythm I always had: early arrival, measured speech, and just enough participation to keep Derek thinking I had accepted my place. I wore the role like an old coat, weathered, invisible, familiar, but behind every nod and every page I handed to Emily, I was watching not just her, but everything. I studied Derek's patterns, the way he favored style over substance, how he outsourced core projects to consultants who sold inspiration but delivered fluff, how he used language like vision shift and strategic agility to hide the cracks widening beneath the surface. I watched as clients quietly distanced themselves, as veteran managers left without fanfare, and as Derek replaced trust with performance dashboards no one believed in. And I took notes not on paper but in memory, which is far more dangerous when honed by time and sharpened by betrayal. It was around then that I started building Carrick Holdings, a shell corporation on paper, named after a town in Maine where my wife once said she wanted to retire. No one paid attention to it, not even my bank, since the early transfers were small enough to avoid flags. I used 5 different brokerages, routing each purchase just below the SEC's disclosure thresholds. Each share I acquired was like placing a brick in a foundation no one knew I was pouring. I spent evenings reading annual reports and board meeting minutes, studying bylaws like a man studying a map through fog. I learned the names of every minor shareholder, tracked who was selling, who was wavering, and who was growing quietly dissatisfied with Derek's regime. I met with attorneys at lunch, spoke to retired analysts who owed me favors, and kept everything buried beneath layers of plausible deniability. By the time the company's stock dipped for the 3rd quarter in a row, I knew the moment had arrived not to retaliate with rage, but to reclaim with precision. What Derek didn't understand, what people like him never do, is that true power isn't taken loudly. It's transferred silently through overlooked channels, dusty contracts, and fine print few bother to read. I didn't need to shout, threaten, or announce anything. I only needed to keep going. At work, Emily continued to parade around like she'd already claimed my office. She offered suggestions in meetings that sounded polished but hollow, misinterpreted key client data, and spoke about market disruption without once asking what our clients actually wanted. Derek ate it up, praising her initiative, assigning her more responsibilities, all while assuming I had faded into irrelevance. But I let her speak. I let them both believe. Because sometimes, the best way to prepare for a storm is to let the sky darken until no one notices you're the one holding the lightning rod. Outside of work, I sold my car and moved into a smaller apartment. Not out of necessity, but strategy. I liquidated a portion of my retirement, redirected everything into Carrick Holdings, and doubled down on my share acquisitions. When a mid-size investment group backed out of Mayfield's 4th quarter round, I swooped in under another name and took their entire stake. Every move was quiet, every move was legal. Every move was earned. Some nights, I questioned it all. Whether the risk was worth it, whether the company was still worth saving. But then I'd remember the interns Gerald mentored, the clients who stayed through economic crashes because they trusted us, and the employees who once told me this job had given them dignity. That's what Derek was throwing away, and that's what I was going to take back, not because I wanted revenge, but because I couldn't bear to see something I helped build turn into something soulless and shallow. This wasn't vengeance, this was restoration. And I was nearly ready. The morning everything changed started like any other quietly, without ceremony, the sky over Chicago still veiled in that soft, steel gray that hangs heavy before snow. I arrived at Mayfield Dynamics before most lights flickered on, carrying nothing but a calm deeper than I'd ever known. There was no anger in my chest, no fear in my stride, only the weight of knowing that, for the first time in a long while, I wasn't walking into someone else's house. I was walking into mine. The receptionist, a young woman named Allie who had joined just after Derek's takeover, looked up as I entered. Her voice lowered into a whisper, almost reverent. "She's already here." I nodded without replying, knowing exactly who she meant. Emily Monroe was waiting in the lobby, arms crossed, scrolling her phone with that same curated confidence she'd worn since day one. Her posture was perfect, her expression unreadable, her heels tapping a rhythm that echoed ambition, but this time, I didn't feel the sting of replacement. I felt completion. She was the last piece in the play, and her role, unbeknownst to her, was already finished. "Good morning," I said, my voice calm, warm, but distant. "Let's get started. There's a campaign I'd like you to review." She followed me without question, settling into my office, still technically mine, where I walked her through a few key accounts, including one she had recently mishandled by ignoring key client feedback. I didn't correct her outright. I let her speak, let her misread the metrics, and misjudge the tone of our core market. For the next hour, I observed every misplaced word and overconfident theory, not as a teacher, but as a witness. At precisely 7 a.m., my phone buzzed once. All filings complete. Boardroom set. 11:00 a.m. It was James Leland, my attorney, a former Mayfield executive who had quietly joined Carrick Holdings 2 months ago. I slipped the phone into my drawer and stood. "I'm afraid we'll have to pause," I said smoothly, rising from my seat. "There's a board meeting I need to attend." Emily blinked, thrown off. "Board meeting?" Derek didn't mention. I don't suppose he did, I said, offering a small, unreadable smile. I walked down the hallway, not with defiance, but with purpose. The kind that doesn't demand attention, but commands it. Every step toward the boardroom was a step away from the years they tried to strip from me, the sleepless nights, the treatments, the betrayals. This wasn't just about reclaiming a title. This was about honoring the man I had once been and the one I had fought to become again. Derek was already there when I arrived, pacing, red-faced, phone pressed to his ear. He turned the moment he saw me, confusion folding into irritation. "Frank, what the hell are you doing? This meeting's for executives only." "I know," I replied, stepping to the head of the table, where I calmly pulled out the chair that had once belonged to Gerald. "That's why I'm here." Before he could speak, the door opened, and one by one, the board members filed in, some surprised, some cautious, all of them carrying the fatigue of months under Derek's control. Most of them had been sidelined since Gerald's passing, their influence hollowed out by Derek's fast-talking consultants and empty charm. But today, they had returned to the table, and today, they would listen. James entered last, carrying a leather folder, his eyes meeting mine with a quiet nod of assurance. Derek looked around, increasingly unsettled, waiting for someone, anyone, to come to his defense. But no one did. "I called this meeting," I said, my voice steady. As the majority shareholder of Mayfield Dynamics, the room fell into silence so complete you could hear the hum of the air vents. Derek scoffed, arms folded, trying to regain footing. "That's absurd. Carrick Holdings is just a third-party firm. They have no stake." "They do," James interrupted, opening the folder. "As of this morning, Carrick Holdings owns 1.4% of Mayfield Dynamics. All filings have been verified by the SEC. Derek's face lost all color. "That's not. You're not. You can't." "I am," I said, cutting in quietly. "And I did." He stumbled back a step, as if the name alone had struck him. "You're Carrick?" "Carrick was my wife's dream town," I said, my voice dipping lower. "She never made it there. But I did. And I brought this company with me." His eyes darted from face to face, searching for support. He found none. "You think you can take this from me?" he barked. "I built this company." "No," I replied. "Gerald built it. You hollowed it out, and I brought it back." I pulled a photo from my briefcase, an old one, a black and white shot of Gerald and me at the 10-year anniversary gala, standing shoulder to shoulder. I placed it at the center of the table. This place was founded on values, not vanity, on loyalty, on leadership, on people. You forgot that, Derek. I never did. Janet Klein, the longest-serving board member, rose from her seat. "I move to vote on a change in executive leadership." Second, came another voice. And just like that, in under 5 minutes, the vote was unanimous. Derek Langston was no longer CEO. He shouted about lawsuits, about betrayal, about legacy. Security was called. I didn't respond. I simply watched him be escorted out of the building that had once held his illusion of control. The building that was never really his to begin with. And when the elevator doors finally closed, I didn't celebrate. I didn't cheer. I just stood there quietly, knowing that the soul of this company had just come home. The hours following Derek's removal were not marked by champagne corks or triumphant applause. There was no grand celebration, no parade of victory laps, just a heavy, profound silence that lingered in every corridor, as if the building itself had been holding its breath for far too long and was finally allowed to exhale. For me, the moment was never about watching someone fall. It was about pulling something up from the ashes, something that once had a soul, a purpose, and a name people were proud to stand behind. That afternoon, I returned to the office that had once been stripped of its character, the space where hollow slogans had replaced real vision, and people had learned to lower their voices instead of raising ideas. But now, with Derek gone and the dust beginning to settle, there was finally room to breathe again. I took off my coat, not as a gesture of ownership, but as a signal that the real work was about to begin. The first thing I did was call Maya Glenn into the office. She'd been in HR for over a decade, one of the quiet pillars who held things together while others climbed over each other for titles. She walked in holding a stack of personnel files and an expression I hadn't seen in years. hope tempered with caution. "We're not building a new company," I said as she sat. "We're remembering who we were before we let fear lead us." She nodded and opened the files without hesitation, already knowing where to begin. For hours, we combed through names, not just resumes or performance reviews, but people we had both seen do the quiet, unglamorous work that had kept this place alive during its darkest years. There was Nathan Rhodes, a strategist with a quiet mind and steady hands, who had led two of our most profitable campaigns and been overlooked for promotion because he wasn't loud enough in meetings. And Tasha Lynn, a junior developer whose clean, elegant code had fixed systems 3 layers above her pay grade, but whose name never once appeared in leadership emails. For every file we reviewed, I asked one question: have they ever been heard? If the answer was no, I asked for a meeting. Within the first week, we began restoring what had been lost. We reestablished the mentorship program Gerald once championed, not as a box-ticking initiative, but as a living bridge between generations. We didn't just pair veterans with newcomers. We built trust circles, learning labs, and something I called listening hours, times when leadership sat, without agenda or defense, and simply listened. The energy began to shift almost immediately, where once there was tension and silence, now there were ideas sketched on whiteboards, sticky notes passed across desks, and laughter that didn't feel cautious or rehearsed. Employees stopped walking on eggshells and started walking into rooms like they belonged there. We reopened the innovation lab Derek had shut down in his 3rd month. Within days, it was humming with life. One team developed a prototype that streamlined interdepartmental communication, something the company had needed for years but had never prioritized. Another team began reimagining our client retention system, using insights drawn directly from the people who worked with those clients every day, not just the executives who skimmed reports. I didn't micromanage. I guided, I redirected, and more than anything, I listened. I walked the halls at odd hours, not to catch anyone slipping, but to remind them I was there not above them, but beside them. I stopped in break rooms, asked about people's kids, their sick parents, their side projects. I remember birthdays. I followed up. Slowly, the walls between departments and, more importantly, the walls between people began to fall away. Clients began returning, first with cautious inquiries, then with full contracts. Some mentioned the shift in tone. Others spoke of the return of integrity. A longtime client from Seattle, one who had quietly backed away under Derek's leadership, called me personally to say, "Frank, it finally feels like Mayfield again." Emily Monroe, for her part, lasted another 2 days before handing in her resignation. To her credit, she didn't make excuses. She walked into my office with her shoulders squared, admitted she wasn't the right fit, and thanked me for the clarity. I nodded, shook her hand, and told her what I wish someone had once told me: titles are temporary, but the way you treat people, that's what stays with them. Her departure didn't mark a loss. It marked a shift from performance to authenticity, from bluster to purpose. Over the next month, we continued restoring not just processes, but identity. We tore down outdated hierarchies, invited feedback from every level, and implemented a policy that no good idea could be ignored just because of where it came from. When one junior analyst anonymously submitted a cost-saving strategy that ended up saving us $800 annually, I didn't just approve it, I walked down to her desk and thanked her in front of her team. We weren't rebuilding a company, we were rebuilding belief. And for the first time in years, I saw something in people's eyes that no metric could ever quantify: belonging. Not the forced kind that comes with forced fun days or branded mugs, but the kind that makes people show up early, not because they're afraid of being late, but because they care about what they're building. This wasn't revenge. This was restoration of trust, of dignity, of purpose. And it was only the beginning. It had been 1 year to the day since I walked into that boardroom and watched the old era collapse in silence. 12 months since Derek Langston stormed out of a company he never truly understood, and I stepped back into a legacy that was never about titles or control, but about responsibility to the people who had been ignored, to the culture that had been broken, and to the values that once made this place more than just a job. That morning, as I stood backstage at our town hall gathering, I could feel the quiet anticipation humming through the auditorium. The seats were filled with familiar faces, some new, some older, many who had once been pushed to the shadows. Yet now, there they were, sitting upright, engaged, waiting not for a speech, but for something they hadn't felt in years. Purpose. I stepped onto the stage without notes. I didn't need them. Everything I had to say lived in the lines on my hands, the miles in my bones, and the quiet in my chest that only comes from surviving what you were never meant to. Exactly 1 year ago today, I began. This company stood on the edge of something uncertain. Not because we lacked talent, not because we lacked drive, but because we had forgotten who we were when no one was watching. I paused, scanning the room, not for applause, but for connection. Dozens of heads nodded. Slowly, silently, I continued. I didn't take this position to prove anything. I didn't come back to take a throne or to get even. I came back because I knew we still had something here worth fighting for. And I wasn't alone. The applause that followed wasn't loud. It was warm, the kind that feels like a handshake between souls. Behind me, the company's new emblem flickered on the screen. A subtle redesign, cleaner, more grounded, but with the same roots. Beside it, a photo of Gerald Mayfield, arm around my shoulder, both of us smiling under a string of old anniversary banners, came into view. The room fell quiet again. This man, I said softly, once told me that success isn't what you leave behind. It's what you build while you're still here. And I've carried that with me through every sleepless night, every hard choice, and every quiet victory. I clicked to the final slide, a new initiative, one I had dreamt of for years but never had the power to create. The Mayfield Fellowship, a mentorship and scholarship program for working adults over 40 looking to return to or reinvent their careers. The kind of people most companies overlook, the kind I would have been had I not fought back. This is our promise, I said. Not just to our clients, but to one another. We will build people, not just products. The crowd stood. Some clapped. Some cried. Some simply stood in silence, moved not by the announcement, but by the return of something they thought they'd never feel again, dignity. That evening, as the building slowly emptied and the last echo of conversation faded down the halls, I sat alone in my office, staring at the old frame on my desk. It held a handwritten note from Gerald that I had tucked away years ago, back when I still believed loyalty alone would protect me from the world. Keep your compass true, even when the map burns. My phone buzzed once. A new message. Subject: Thank you from Margaret Mayfield. I opened it and read every word slowly, letting them settle like snow. Frank, I've watched this past year from a distance, uncertain of what would come after Gerald. I worried, like many did, that his vision would fade once he was gone. But what you've done, not just in taking control, but in leading with purpose, has restored not just this company, but something in me I thought I'd lost. He believed in you from the beginning, and now I see why. Thank you for saving what mattered most. Margaret, I set the phone down and let the silence stretch, no longer empty, but full of memory, full of gratitude, and full of the quiet truth that none of this had been about revenge. It had been about restoration, about making room again for the people who were once told they were too old, too tired, too broken, or simply no longer needed. I rose from my chair and walked down the hall toward the central wall outside the boardroom. The paint had been refreshed, the lighting softer, but one section had been left untouched except for a new addition, a quote framed in black walnut. Success isn't about what you take, it's about what you build while you're still here. Gerald Mayfield. I reached out and placed my hand gently against the wood. We did it, Gerald. Behind me, laughter rose from the break room. Someone had left a tray of cookies on the counter with a sticky note. Take one, you earned it. And in that moment, I realized so had I. Call to action, CTA. If this story spoke to something inside you, if you've ever felt forgotten, replaced, or underestimated, know this: you're not done yet. The road back may be long, but every quiet step counts. Subscribe for more true stories of strength, justice, and the kind of comebacks that don't shout, they endure. Because no one gets to write your ending but you.